Hello everyone, and welcome to the Best Practices in DITA Authoring webcast with Tony Self. My name is Sarah O'Keefe. I just have a quick introductory thing for you. As usual, we will make the recording available after the fact, and we will be taking questions about 45 or 40 minutes into the webcast. Questions will not be recorded. People do not appear on the questions. If you have questions, use the Questions tab in the GoToWebinar interface. And I also wanted to mention that through the glories of Lightning Source and print on demand and international distribution, Tony's book, after about 3 days, is now available in the U.S. and at a couple of places, in Canada and also in Australia at angersrobertson.com.au. And with that, I'm going to say welcome to Tony and turn it over to him.
Thanks, Sarah, and hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me fairly clearly, and I hope you enjoy the next hour or so with me, and I hope that you also get to learn something. The topic of today's webinar is aiming for best practice in DITA authoring, and I just thought I'd start with a little bit of context, and that is that the information I'm going to be sharing with you today is informed, to use a fancy word, informed by academic research that I'm doing at Swinburne University. And so, in fact, the DITA Style Guide book that Sarah's mentioned is now available. Was really one of the results of that academic research. And in academic research, there's generally a research question, and my research question was what constitutes best practice in DITA for technical publications. So that was what I was trying to address, and that's how the Style Guide came about. So one of the first things that we probably need to work out is what exactly is best practice. And I suppose best practice means different things to different people, and it's a little bit like the word quality. Quality, some people take to mean of a high quality. For example, I've got a quality motor car. Then that presumably means high quality and not low quality. But quality can be high quality and it can be low quality. It can be poor quality, it can be good quality. And likewise, best practice can mean different things. So best practice for a particular organization might be awful practice in a broader context. So in quality management, there's international standards for quality management, and part of the principle of quality management is you choose what level of quality you want to have and choose whether you want to improve it, which most people do, and then you aim to improve your quality. And I thought from a best practice point of view, what we should be really talking about is better practice. So this should really mean for normal practitioners like us, when we're talking about best practice, we should be really talking about improving our practice, because the absolute very best practice is probably something that's too difficult to achieve. And that absolute best practice is probably the adoption of work practices that reflect the most efficient and effective that are practically possible. And that definition will still work for us because there's that out clause that are practically possible. So, for example, best practice might, in technical communication, might say always get a professional proofreader to check your work. But in practice, using another explanation of or use of the word, in practice that might be difficult because you don't have the budget to employ a proofreader. So. What we generally find, therefore, is that very few achieve that best practice, but many can aim for it. And so that's probably the main message here, is that best practice is something that should be aimed for. When we do aim for best practice, the principles that we should be adopting is that we should understand different alternatives. So we should understand what's possible. We should minimize inefficiencies, so not remove them, because that's impossible, but we should minimize them, and likewise reduce any process bottlenecks. We should choose the most effective methods that we can, that are practical for us, and we should standardize. Now, speaking of the word standardize, I want to focus a little bit more on that now. If we think about what conventional best practice is, so if we're just talking not about DITA or anything like that, but just in technical communication, what best practice currently is, we could probably find a few things, and most of them relate to standards. For example, we've probably got standard editing marks that we use. So if we're working in a team and somebody's editing somebody else's work, then we probably use standard editing marks. We almost certainly have standard spelling. And likewise, we probably have some standard punctuation rules. Now, punctuation is obviously a contentious issue because different people have different views of punctuation. And in another good example is in Australian English, the, I suppose, generally accepted punctuation rules are a little bit different from the generally accepted punctuation rules for US English. So in conventional best practice in a technical publications department, there's probably some sort of standard punctuation rules that a team uses. Likewise, there's different standard, different paper sizes, and most of those are standardized. And again, that's something that varies from country to country. So in the US, the standard, the typical standard office paper size is something called letter, but in most other countries of the world, the standard paper size for typical office documents is A4. So again, in conventional best practice, we have standard paper sizes, and then it goes on to the writing tools we use. If we're working in a team, we all use the same writing tools. And printing metrics and presentation conventions, how we present various things, what we put in bold, what we put in italic, and so on, what we indent. And even the methodologies that we use for creating content. For example, in your department, you might use information mapping as a methodology. So that's also part of the best practice rules for within a particular organization. And when we think then about all those the best practice ideas that I've currently got displayed on the screen, is how do you record those? How do you record what editing marks you use in your department, and what spelling you use, and what punctuation rules, etc.? And the answer is you capture those into some sort of style guide. Now, in some cases, you might use a generic, or what I've called a super organizational style guide, like Chicago, or in other cases, you might use your own handcrafted style guide, something that's specific to your company or your department. But in most cases, you'll use a mix of those. And that's where the DITA style guide that I've put together is meant to exist. It's meant to exist as a tool to be used for standardizing within technical publication departments so that people can achieve better practice. Now, by the way, there'll be time for questions at the end, so don't feel that if there's something that you want to pursue with me, just take a note of it, and we'll come back to that later. Now, this picture or diagram is meant to illustrate then, in very broad terms, how the structure of the style guide came together, or how the content was selected, I guess. And I've said there that there was probably three main sources for the DITA style guide, and one was Chicago, or something like that. And so those are those super organizational style guides that you buy in a bookshop, and so on. And I don't know whether many people use it, but there's an international standard, 26514, for software documentation, so that might be also something that you use to encourage standardization, and so that was sort of part of one of the resources that informed the DITA style guide. And the DITA language reference also has some style information in it. So from the point of view of what sort of style information do we need specifically for DITA authoring, we would find some of it in Chicago, some of it in international standards, and some of it in the DITA language references, the official DITA documentation and specification. And then when we filter all those through, we chuck out the presentational style stuff, and keep the writing style stuff, the stuff that applies to the practices we perform when we're writing or composing or drafting our content. Now, I'll come back to that idea of separating presentational stuff from the content or the writing stuff in a moment, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page with DITA. And so if we try to find a definition of what DITA is, this one's probably as good as any. DITA is a new open standard, and notice the word standard, a new open standard for the creation and management of written documents such as policies and procedures, teaching and learning documents, help system, websites, and instruction manuals. Being a little bit more pragmatic about it, DITA is many things in one. It's an XML language, it's a writing methodology, it's a topic-based information architecture, and it's a structured authoring platform. If we then say, what does it mean to technical writers, we say, well, realistically, what that really means is that DITA separates content utterly from its presentation by using semantics as the basis for markup. So that's probably the big thing. We mark up not based on the presentation, but based on the semantics. The other big thing is that DITA is a modular documentation approach, and that means it's very different from the ways we've previously written documents, which is probably what I'd call linear writing, which is the user guide type of writing where you start at page 1 and go to page 100, and style-based markup. And so style-based markup is where we mark things up as bold and italic and indented and 12-point in order to differentiate the different components of the document or a topic. So the two differences in practice that I think we should focus on are firstly that separation of content and form, where the author is not concerned with the presentational form. Now, and that's what I'm pursuing, or what I've pursued with the DITA Style Guide. There's no information on presentational form. It doesn't tell you whether serif is better than sans serif. It doesn't mention point sizes. It doesn't mention anything else to do with layout. It only talks about authoring. And so that's again, the strict position I've taken is that DITA authoring does not have anything to do with presentation. And the other difference that we're meant to focus on now is separation of content and form and modularity. So that modularity has a big impact as well. And that's primarily because we write documents as reusable components. So a topic theoretically doesn't belong in any document, and in any one document. It can belong in another. Okay, now just to make sure this I'm explaining this properly, the linear approach, and so that's the old-fashioned approach, and probably the approach before help systems and web intranet documents came out, was where you would work on a document, for example, a Word document, and you'd create one file. And start, you wouldn't necessarily start at the top and finish at the bottom, but the end result would be you would have a linear narrative that starts at page 1 and runs through to page 100. Whereas our new modular approach is you work on individual topics in some sort of repository, and then when you feel like it, you produce different forms of output in different media, depending upon the needs that you might have. Now that change came about because there have been different influences on technical communication. And these influences are not going away. So the influences are becoming stronger and stronger. So here's a few of the things that are pushing on the technical communication profession. So there's globalization, there's the need for embedded user assistance, there's modularity, there's the metadata standards like Dublin Core, there's the idea of faceted navigation, of single sourcing, reuse, agile development teams, etc. And so all of those influences mean that technical communication has to change. And that's, I guess, why we changed, one of the reasons why we've changed from the linear approach, the linear style-based approach, to the modular semantic-based approach. Okay, I said I'd come back to the separation of content and form, so let's do that now. So DITA incorporates the idea of separation of content from formatting and from delivery. And so again, that practically means that from an author's perspective, in the perfect world, the author works on content and doesn't work on any formatting or output. So the author needs to create those documents in a neutral format. And for presentation and delivery to the reader, the source documents are transformed using an automated process into some reading format. And so the steps involved are build, compile, publish, transform. That last step, I phrased it wrongly, that last step of transformation might be called build or compile or publish or transform, but that's that last stage of the process where the source documents are automatically prepared into a format suitable for delivery to the end user or the reader. Now, it's not, and again, realistically, it's not just a magic button that you press and miraculously it all comes together. There has to be some other work that goes on in the background. And so one of the work practice changes is that we need to separate roles a little bit more clearly as well. So separation of content and form and delivery means separation of the role of the content creator from the presentation creator from the delivery person. And so this diagram, a little bit complicated, but it might help illustrate a little. And again, these aren't. This is the perfect world. So when it comes to your department or your particular situation, it might be a little bit different. And it could well be that one person is doing a number of these roles, but in theory, we should have a specific role for a schema designer, a specific role for an information architect, a specific role for a programmer, graphic designer, an information producer or an information writer, and for a publisher. So the technical communication part, so the part where we want to focus on standards and best practice, is not in this area, this orange area, because this is more of the information architect area where it's talking about planning and designing a suite of documents and planning and designing individual documents and allocating writing work. So the style guide and style guides generally don't really cover that area. Likewise, if there's specification of the information types that are used, that's not really covered as well, because specialization really means making something special for your particular scenario. And so it's hard to write a style guide that covers all of those possible million scenarios, those individual scenarios. However, that's from the point of view of a generic style guide. When you're creating your own departmental style guide, you certainly should document how your specializations work if you are doing specialization and if you have employed a schema designer to create the specialization. Now, under the separation of content and form, we said that there was this build or compile or transform process, and so we said it's an automated process, but the templates or the rules for transformation need to be created, and so somebody, probably a more programmer type of person, might create those transforming routines. So the look and feel part, which sort of plugs into the equation, might be created or managed by a graphic designer, creating a CSS file or some other look and feel rules that eventually get incorporated into the templates or the transformers or whatever you want to call them. But again, we're not really interested in that side of things, because what we're interested in is the person who writes the topics, that does the heavy lifting. That this is the core, the heart, the soul of technical writing is writing, and so that's what we really want to focus on in best practice. Oops, and not publishing. There we go. Okay, so looking at that, the information developer's role, or the author's role, the technical writer's role within that, that author's role is to mark up the document using semantic elements. Do not consider, the job is not to consider page size or font or margins or padding or kerning or anything like that. It's to concentrate on getting the semantics right, to getting the markup of the semantic elements correct, and to focus on writing standalone topics, not on writing documents. Now, the information architect's role is to define which topics need writing. Remember, we started with that, define which topics need writing and assemble those topics into collections of topics. That person may be the same as the author, but it is a distinct role. And that's also good because as well as separating content and form and delivery, we should also be separating planning out from the writing. So that's one of the good things about the methodology part of DITA, that it encourages that separation. And separation leads to greater efficiency, and greater efficiency is one of those things that we said constitutes best practice. And I think we've discussed that the styling and the aesthetic presentation isn't left out of the equation. It's done by somebody else. So it's not our job, it's somebody else's job. And some styling jobs start morphing into programming jobs. But again, that's not, and it involves XSL Pro and an XSL team, those sorts of things. But we don't need to bother about that because we're concentrating on the authoring side of things. And likewise, there is a job for somebody to do to press the button and say, output this as an EPUB. But again, that's probably somebody else's job, or else it's so trivial that we don't even worry about it. So I suppose summarising that little section, we'd say that in a DITA authoring model, most things are different. Perhaps everything is different, is a bit strange, or is a bit extreme, but most things are different. It means that we probably, if we're not used to semantic authoring, things are going to seem a bit alien. So the semantic authoring approach, the disconnection from style might be a bit alien. The modular approach, being able to write topics as standalone topics without any regard to what document they're going to be published in, that's probably going to be a bit alien. The idea of reuse might be alien, and some of the other parts of the DITA philosophy, such as minimalism, might also be alien too. So that's what makes authoring quite different in a DITA environment. And that brings us back to the need for a DITA style guide. And so what do if we think about what sort of things would we incorporate in a DITA style guide? Why would it have to be different? That diagram before that says what we distilled, and we distill the writing practice, what would that be? So let's examine that question, starting perhaps by trying to define what a style manual is. And this is probably a good summary. It's a set of standards governing the design and the writing of documents. So design and writing. Then that design word is difficult too, because design could mean the way you've designed a sentence and a paragraph and a topic and a chapter, or it could mean the colors that you've chosen. So we have to be careful of that word design. Anyway, style manual usually takes the form of a printed manual, and the originators of traditional style manuals are probably publishing organizations, like Chicago University Press, which is the organization behind the Chicago Manual of Style. Might be standards bodies, such as International Standards Organization, which is behind, say, that ISO 26514. Could be government agencies, or could be publication departments. So your own publication department might have a style guide as well. And examples that used in my field of work, or in my area, one you probably, unless there's any Australians on the line, a lot of you might not have heard of the AGPS style manual. It's probably the dominant style manual for writing in Australia, and it stands for the Australian Government Publishing Service style manual. It's actually, that's not its official name anymore. It sort of went, it was privatised. So it used to be a government publication, but it was privatised, and so it has a different name, but everybody still knows it as the AGPS style manual. There's Chicago Manual of Style, which is popular in the English-speaking language worldwide, and is probably the dominant style manual in the English-speaking world. And another one that I came across was the News Limited Style Manual, which is a style manual used by journalists within Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. And that is another good example. So presumably journalists would be very familiar with that style manual and are likely to have that style manual on their desks rather than Chicago or AGPS. So why would we, if there's style manuals around, why do we need a special DITA style manual? Well, we said that style manuals promote consistency, and consistency leads to a greater authority for your work. So if your manual or publication, whatever it is, your website, your help system, has consistent content, consistent spelling, consistent punctuation, consistent presentation, then that leads to a greater authority. The reader perceives that manual to be more authoritative than if it was inconsistent, and it leads to greater readability. Now, existing style manuals, like the ones we mentioned, AGPS and Chicago, focus on style-based authoring. So they talk about indents and about use of italics and where you should put full stops and how you should arrange quotation marks. And most of those are entirely unsuitable for semantic authoring. So when you pick up Chicago, you find, yes, some things such as choice of spelling might be appropriate, but other bits, even some bits on punctuation, are no longer appropriate when you move to semantic authoring in a modular environment. And so that makes adoption of DITA a little bit difficult if there's no style manual to work to. And so that, I suppose, is a good summary of why we need a DITA style manual to promote consistency in this special authoring environment where existing style manuals don't really work for us. And just to illustrate that, we're talking about the separation of content and style here. Got a diagram here that shows the AGPS style manual, that's its official name, the style manual for authors, editors and printers, is made up of the orangey colour is presentational style, so it's about 55% covers presentational style and only 45% contains content information. So there's still good content information there. I'm not saying it's all about presentational style, but the focus is on presentational style, not writing style. I found a New Zealand style book, style guide for New Zealand writers and editors, and a little bit better, I suppose. There's only 42% on presentational style, but still a substantial proportion is covering presentational style. In Chicago, it's about 70% of Chicago covers presentational style, so only 30% is actually about the writing part of it. So, and again, I'm not saying that that's useless, or 30% is hopeless. 30% is a big volume of content, so that's good. But again, some of that information, even though it does concern writing, is not of relevance to DITA writing. Now, interestingly, I mentioned the news style manual, and that was 100% about content or editorial style. So it had no information on presentational style at all. And so that almost became a model for the DITA style guide. And when you think about why that would be, why don't they cover presentational style, is because News Limited already have moved to semantic XML-based markup. So they do content reuse, a topic or a story that's written in journalistic parlance, a story that's written by a news journalist might appear on a website, might appear on in the New York Times, might appear in the Australian, could appear anywhere. Could appear in a magazine or even on a television news bulletin. So from that point of view, News Limited also needed to separate content from style. And so, so their style manual is quite interesting. If you can grab a hold of that and have a read of it, it is actually quite interesting. But not, but again, it covers good material, but it's not relevant to a DITA, or a lot of it is not relevant to a DITA authoring environment. So the way we use style manuals as well, and this is a typical scenario here, it's currently we don't use style manuals in isolation. So for me, when I'm writing some content, this might be how I put together my set of style guides. So a dictionary is a style guide when you think about it. It's a tool we use to create consistency. And so in Australia, the standardized dictionary is called the Macquarie. So I might use a Macquarie dictionary, and I might use that in conjunction with, say, the Microsoft Manual of Style. So in some cases, some Australian English spelling might be overridden by computer English that might be covered. For example, in Australian English, when you're talking about a program, you might spell that double M-E, but when you're talking about a computer program, you would spell it with a single M. So in some cases, you might supplement your Australian English words with specialized computer English words. I might also have on my desk something, Fowler's Modern English Usage, and so that also informs my corporate style, and I might use AGPS, and I might also be influenced by the marketing department's house style guide, use of the logo and standard PMS colors, etc. And so all of those influences create what we might call the corporate style manual, which might be formalized. It might be formalized into a printed document or an online resource, or it could be something that's more unwritten but agreed between members of the writing team. And so ultimately they're the rules that govern the publications we produce in the traditional approach. And so I'm suggesting in the DITA environment, it's the same sort of thing, except that we have slightly different influences. So we still have things such as Macquarie and Microsoft Manual Style, etc. And we probably still use some of the information out of traditional style guides, even though we're using less out of them. But then ultimately we probably need to have those sort of resources channeled into some form of open source standardized style manual that just looks at the content, and then we have something different that looks at the form. Because when we think about how style manuals should approach or should encourage consistency, there are two separate pieces. There's the consistency of the content and there's consistency of the form. And the consistency of the form is likely to be isolated within an organization. Very few organizations want their manuals to look like everybody else's manuals. However, it's probably achievable to say, ideally, we should have the writing consistent across all organizations. And I know there'll be language differences and there'll be some minor variations, but idealistically, it would be good if all technical communicators wrote to the same style for content, not for presentation, but for content. And so that's what I thought ultimately the DITA Style Manual should fit in that category. So ultimately I thought the DITA Style Manual should be some sort of open source standard style manual that technical communicators agree to. And that's the ambition of the DITA Style Guide in the medium term. It will be moved into a wiki style of resource, hopefully a DITA-based wiki, and then the idea is it will become a community resource which will help it develop and go further. And that's another point I should make here, that in my research I found that the Chicago Style Manual started all those years ago as a set of papers stapled together, and it slowly grew to becoming the big heavy book it is today. So what you see currently with the DITA Style Guide is probably unlikely to be what it will be like in 10 years' time, when it's an open source standard style manual in some sort of wiki form. So that's the big picture, I guess. Okay, now style guides, just to recap, document the standards and conventions that we use. They've traditionally been policed by the manager or the editor and self-policed by the authors themselves. So for an example, we might have a style manual that stipulates that every topic should have a primary heading that describes the content of the topic. And when we think about it, DITA's language reference, the document that OASIS produces, the standards body that looks after DITA, creates a language reference that forms some sort of style guide. It does give you some guidelines for when you're meant to use the various semantic elements. in DITA. For example, it gives you guidelines on when you should use UI control. They're not quite, as we'll find out, they're not quite detailed enough for a lot of practical use, but they're a start. Now, in DITA, and like in any XML, many requirements can be policed by the validating editor. So if we're using a DITA editor, like a dedicated DITA authoring tool, some of the rules of DITA, not all, but some of the rules of DITA can be enforced by the editor. For example, a DITA rule is that you must have a topic. So in the past, the style guide says you must have a topic. In the DITA environment, the DITA standard says you must have a topic, and if you don't create a topic, the topic won't save. It'll say invalid, cannot save it, or it will warn you that you've broken the rules. So in that way, in DITA, some rules are policed automatically by the software, and other rules still need to be policed or managed by the team, by the editor, the manager, or the authors. And going back to the need for a style manual, or for a DITA style manual, and when we talked about having super organizational style, that is style rules that don't apply just to our organization, so we don't reinvent the wheel all the time. We have common writing standards across the technical writing community broadly. Now, one of the principles of that is, or one of the benefits that that allows is interchange. DITA makes it possible that if I'm, say, producing a car manual, and a car these days uses components from various other companies, then I can ask other companies, for example, the people that make the windscreen wipers, to write that part of the manual for me and supply it as part of the contract to supply windscreen wipers. And if they provide that in DITA, written to the same standards as what I want, what my content written, then I should be able to plug that topic directly into my manual without rewriting it. When it's generated as an output, yes, it'll have the same presentational form. It'll look like my car manual. It'll look like it's part of it. And as much as possible, it will read the same as the remainder of my content. But certainly it will be marked up using the same semantic rules that I'm using. And so if DITA genuinely, and DITA does genuinely enable the idea of interchange across organizations, then we should be making sure that we're putting in place steps that encourage that interchange, that we don't create obstacles that means, oh, well, when I get a DITA topic with somebody else, obviously I need to rewrite it because they use UI control when I use user input. So the achievement of what I've described as WOO, write once and once only. So I write my windscreen wiper manual once, and it doesn't matter which car my windscreen wipers go in. My topic just needs to be written once, is possible if we have a super organizational style guide for DITA. So I think I've explained that. Companies supplying components should supply the documentation and so on. So the DITA standard helps with that, and but the gaps in the DITA standard can be filled by a DITA style guide. So summarizing where we're up to, we're saying that then the DITA style manual is a super organizational semantic markup rule set. It's important, particularly when the formal language rules themselves are open to interpretation, so when the DITA language reference is not clear, and that's in the majority of cases, then it's important to have another guide. Here's another example. In DITA, there's an element called var name or variable name, and there's also an element called API name. Now, it's very difficult to work out which one of those you should use in a particular circumstance, because you say, well, it's not quite a variable. It's an attribute or something, or it's a parameter, but it's not really an API. So I'm not sure which one it is. Another example would be for the name of a routine or a function that you pass. Which one is it? So there are those gaps in the standard, and so that's one of the reasons why we need some other DITA style guide. Another example would be if you want to use, say, even the term Darwin information typing architecture. Is that a term? Is it a phrase? Is it a keyword? Or you want to use the term Microsoft Word. Like I've described that as a term, but is that really a term, or is it a phrase, or is it a keyword? Now, you could mark it up in any of those, and it would be technically valid DITA. But if 3 people are approaching that same problem, they'll probably choose 3 different options. And so that doesn't encourage interchange or standardization. So that's probably another good example of what this DITA Style manual covers. The DITA language reference is sometimes a bit impenetrable because it's full of technical information, and so it's not good for non-technical people, technical authors. And it doesn't have a lot of practical things as well to do with, so in other words, in some cases, the practicalities are left exposed. For example, if you have a stem sentence that leads to a list, stem sentence followed by a list, then there's many ways that that could be marked up. So you could have a paragraph, and then inside that paragraph you could have the list items, or you could have the list separate from the paragraph. You could have a paragraph, then the list, then a list item, then paragraphs within that list item. So there's probably, for a simple scenario like that, there's probably 5 different choices that would all be perfectly technically valid in DITA. So from the consistency point of view, we should be able to look at some resource and say, well, this is the method that we're going to use. And that's also interesting that most style guides are not saying this is the correct way of doing something, because you could argue about which is the correct spelling, which is the correct punctuation, which is the correct markup approach. So it's more saying this is the agreed, or this is a standard, or this is a good choice. It's not necessarily the right choice, but it's a good enough choice. And so that's really where the DITA Style Manual tries to fit in. And currently with the Style Manual, obviously the DITA Style Manual published by Scriptorium doesn't have the authority of the Chicago Style Manual that's been built up, that has built up a reputation over many years and is published by Chicago University. So the authority of the Style Manuals intended will eventually be built up by ownership, and particularly when it moves to open source, but by ownership of the DITA authoring community. So that's the big aim of it. Okay. So I thought we'd look at a few examples, and then we should have time for some questions, or we will have time for some questions. So don't bother reading this too much, but this is an extract from the DITA language reference, and it talks about the use of the command element. And this is a good illustration of what I was saying before, which was the language reference goes some way to providing some standards. So this says the command element is required as the first element. Use active voice instruction, that's terrific. Step, we shouldn't have more than 1 sentence in a step, and so on. So it has some good information there. And it tells you what you're allowed to have before and after, etc. But it tends, and this is probably one of the clearest examples, but it so it does contain some rules, but unfortunately those sort of rules or guidelines are camouflaged by the rest of the technical information within it. So the DITA Style Guide might cover different things, such as the DITA Style Guide suggests that you use short descriptions for all your topics. So it's not compulsory. The DITA language reference doesn't have any guidance on it. It just says it's an optional element. But for consistency, the DITA Style Guide says you should use it. To answer the question of, or a typical question of the user saying, oh, I've got keystrokes, I'm going to get the person to type, like, has to tab F3. What element should I use for that? And so the DITA Style Guide says you should use the UI control, user interface control element should be used when describing keys on a keyboard. So if you're talking about the tab key, then you should use UI control. But if you're talking about a sequence of keystrokes that the user has to import, then user input should be used. So it's a lot more practical and answering specific questions that a user might have. So that's where it varies a lot from the DITA language reference. It also has much more detailed explanation, and it has tool neutral markup examples. So again, in that idea of separation of content and form, it's also making sure that it is valid across many organizations, that super organizational idea, by not saying, oh, this is just for, this is an example of how this is used in oxygen. So it doesn't have any of those examples, so it does uses neutral markup examples. Here's another example, and again, this is too big to go through, but I'm just trying to illustrate. In that question of what element should I use for keystrokes, if you look at the DITA language reference, or if you just stumble along looking at the element choices that you might be given in your authoring tool, it's not really immediately obvious which one you're meant to use. So, and UI control is perfectly okay for that. You could say, well, user interface control, that's as good a choice as any. That's a good choice. User input, good choice also. And you could then mount an argument for, you could say, oh no, you should use UI control, but somebody else could also create a similarly strong argument to always use user input. But when we're talking about standardizing, we're talking about agreeing with things. I disagree with many things in the Chicago Manual of Style, but that doesn't mean that I'm right and they're wrong. It just means that we have different opinions. But from the styling point of view, from the consistency point of view, of course I need to comply with whatever it says in Chicago, if that's my guiding principle, if that's the part of the style guide suite that I'm using. Now, the shot that you see on the screen there is actually taken directly out of the DITA Style manual. So that's the sort of thing that how it describes things. It discusses what the issues are. It gives you a tool-neutral format, and then tries to give you some warnings or notes. For example, another element you might have chosen is shortcut, but it's saying don't use shortcut for this. This element is intended for keyboard shortcuts in user interface control. So that's what it's intended for, so don't use that. So use these other elements in the appropriate context. So it tries to give plain English scenario-based explanations for use of semantic elements, and it gives you tool-neutral markup. We touched on the idea of controversy. So what happens if you disagree? If I disagree with Chicago, well, tough luck. But it's more likely that because I don't, or the DITA Style manual doesn't have the authority of Chicago, you're more likely to disagree with what I've put in the DITA Style guide. Now, by the way, I just didn't say, oh, I think I'll be God this week and I'll make up all these decisions. How I arrived at these decisions or rules or guidelines was by working my way through a number of resources, including the Yahoo DITA user group correspondence and the OASIS DITA technical committee correspondence, to look for questions that DITA authors had asked and to see how different people had answered those questions. So in some cases it's fairly clear cut, so the experts or authorities have made particular suggestions, and so I've adopted those. In other cases there's disagreement amongst the experts about which approach you should use, and in that case I've made some sort of decision on that, and I've tried to record my rationale for why I've selected one method over the other. And again, it's not necessarily the right method that I've chosen or the right path, but it's at least something that will allow consistency. So controversial items are likely to be whether you have paragraphs within list items. Lists within the same sentence paragraph where they're grouped together. I suggest that they should be grouped together. But a lot of people will argue, oh my God, you can't do that. So that's just one. So there's likely to be areas of contention. Serial commas are another area of contention, and that's also something that varies from language variety, English language variety, to English language variety. So the use of serial commas differs by convention in US English versus UK English, for example. I've also said that you shouldn't have any punctuation at the end of list items. So if you've got a bulleted list, then you shouldn't have, so there's always controversy over whether they should be commas or semicolons, or whether they should be full sentences or full stops, etc. And I've said if they're not full sentences, there should be no punctuation at the end of list items at all. And I try to provide my rationale for that. And again, so it's not a matter of right or wrong.
I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up for today. I want to thank you all for coming. Sorry about the technical problems. And let us know if you have additional questions. Feel free to send those in, and we will make sure that Tony gets them and that they then come back to you. For those of you asking about the ebook, soon. And I would also point out that if you're in the U.S., Barnes & Noble currently has this book for just over $20, $20.38 at bn.com. That is a really, really good deal. At Amazon, it's more or less list price, which is about $36. So if you're planning to get it, I would go and jump on the Barnes & Noble site at this point, because it does look as though it's much less expensive there.